welcome everyone. Hope you're having a good day. Hope it's started out well and carried on nicely. Thank you for joining. Thank you for coming along. This is a step-by-step watercolor class, whether it's Tuesday or Thursday. It doesn't really matter. It's always step-by-step. I take you through one step at a time so that in time you'll start to see a composition and how it goes together and be able to do your own paintings and drawings outside of this class. And I think some of you are going on to other classes too, so I can see some of your skills improving, which is wonderful. So thank you for carrying on with that. So we will need for this paper towel, some brushes. I've got a handful of brushes. You can see I've got all different kinds. Water, 2 containers of water. Just turn around the labels. I'm not advertising for anyone specific, just water. And of course our canvas. And we've got our picture already posted. I hope you like that one. Someone had asked me to do a picture where there was sunlight with one swipe. And we'll see how this gets created. So it'll be interesting to see how we create this sunlight in the forest. And so, as in all watercolor classes that I do, I like to stop and just get into art mode. So if you have something troubling you, just set that aside on the parking lot of your mind, and we'll just take 3 deep breaths. And as you take that deep breath in, just hold it at the top and then drop your shoulders down as you release that breath. So first, deep breath in. And hold it and release. Second deep breath in and hold it at the top and release. And you can release that breath fast or slow. That's entirely up to you. Third deep breath in and hold it at the top and release. And just give your shoulders a little bit of a massage or a little bit of a shake. We get a lot of tension in here, so it's good to relieve that. And so with that, we're going to do this picture, this sunny forest. We're going to create the forest. I was asked to do something where there was sunlight in the forest, and that's what I've done. So it'll be interesting to see how this comes together. So we'll start with the blank canvas. Now, because I do this backwards, I've put a few lines on mine, but I didn't expect you to do that. So it's just a blank canvas to start. We have a number of different brushes. I have one, I call it a pokey brush. I'll use this for the leaves at the end of the picture. I also have a 2s and 3s. I have a 0 brush, pointed brush. I have a 12 for lots of water, and I have a 6 for minimal amount of water, and I have an angle brush. So I have a lot of brushes today, and I may or may not use them, but I have them handy. So I will start with my number 6 brush, pointed brush, holds a fair bit of water, and I'm going to start to get my canvas wet, just clear water. So I'm wetting the whole canvas all the way down to the bottom. Everything's going to get wet. Right to the other side. And let me switch to my number 12 brush because it's a little bit bigger, holds a little bit more water. Just takes less, oh, it's got some gray on there. Just takes a little bit less work to get the water on there. And I don't need it to be soaking wet, but I do want, when I look at the side, that there's no white spots, no clear, dry areas. And you will need for this, if you've got a paper towel, and 2 containers of water. One I keep clear and one I use for rinsing brushes. And I'm going to take a piece of paper towel at this point, and I'm going to dry the bottom quarter. I'm just going to rub. I've got that primed, but I'm just going to take the paper towel and just dry off the bottom quarter of my picture. So the canvas is primed with the water that I put on there. It won't be completely dry, but I've just dried off the bottom. And now I'm going to get sap green. If you have hooker's green or deep green is fine as well. But I'm going to start with sap green. And I'm coming down about 1/4 of an inch from the top of my paper, coming right across the page, down to where I've dried that bottom quarter. So I'm stopping at that point. So I'm also going to take that green and I'm going to run it along that section at the bottom. So I've got 1/4 of my page is dry down below. And then I'm going to fill in up to the top corner. So I'm using sap green. If you have a different green, that's okay. I'm just filling in that top corner, and I've got that line drawn, leaving room at the bottom. And I'm not worried about it if it's not completely even, my coloring. It doesn't have to be. Now from the bottom corner, I'm going to come up to the side, leaving a white space in between. And I'm going to fill this side in with green as well. Now, watercolor is going to dry 20 to 30% lighter than when you put it on. So this will dry a little bit lighter. And then I'm going to rinse my brush off. I'll have it be damp. So I'll have a damp brush, not soaking wet brush. Now I'm going to run my brush along that line coming down to the bottom. So I want to soften this line. Just using a clean brush with just dampened with fresh water. So I've rinsed my brush off, and I'm not trying to eliminate the line, but I want to soften it. So I'm not trying to take color off, just soften that line. So if it doesn't lighten the first time, just give it a few little brushes. Just gentle, you don't want to damage your paper. And as I said, I'm not worried about if there's streaks in here or it's not completely even. That's okay. We are going to go back and put a secondary coating on these. But before we move on to that, we're going to paint the bottom part of our picture ochre. So I'm not wetting my paper first. I'm just doing wet paint on dry. So it should be it should be dry enough. It was treated already with some water. And it's not necessarily a straight line. So if you don't have a straight line across there, that's okay. And this too doesn't need to be perfectly blended. If you have strokes or stripe, a little bit darker or lighter in different places, that's okay. This is our ground, our earth down below in a forest, leading up to the forest. So if it's lighter or darker, that would be perfectly natural. And if you have excess paint just kind of laying around, you can just pick that paint up and pop it somewhere else onto your opening of your forest floor. Nothing needs to look entirely smooth. Again, if there are bumps and ridges and darker or lighter, that's okay. And now I'm going back in with my sap green, the same green I've used. And I'm just going to put some streaks of that sap green just in my forest. So I'm not doing, this is wet on dry, so I'm just using wet paint. I'm just putting some stripes of color. I might have some lighter and darker, that's okay. And this is where your artistic license comes into play, that you can do whatever you like with it. This is your forest. And once you've got your green, your slashes of green, different colors, a little bit darker, we're going to start to build the forest. I'm using wet paint on dry, although some of my paint might still be wet. If the trees start to look a little bit fuzzy on the outside, that's okay. It will just look like bark. And so I'm going to do my farthest tree, my tree closest to the side. I'm just coming down, starting from the bottom as well, so that I try and get as straight a tree as possible. But it didn't have to be drawn out. So I'm just, if it's not completely straight, if it's got some bumps and ridges in it, that's okay. It's going to look like a tree. This is burnt umber or brown. I'm sorry, I didn't say which color. And the trees are also wider at the bottom than they are at the top. So just have your bottom of your tree just a little bit thicker than at the top. And we'll do another tree beside that one, just about the same size. Remember, just a little bit thicker at the bottom than at the top. And again, still burnt umber. And still working with burnt umber, we'll go right over to the far side of our canvas and do another tree, thicker at the bottom, narrowing at the top. Same color, burnt umber. And we'll do a tree closer to the center, a little bit wider. And a tree right beside it, just about the same size, coming up. And you can see by doing this, just by doing this random, just eyeing it, eyeballing, and just putting those trees in there, that they're not all completely straight, which gives a more natural look. So once you have those trees in there, we're going to start to create the sunlight. So rinsing my brush off and tapping it off on paper towel, I'm going to lift off the brown on my tree where the sun would be hitting it. So I'm lifting off that section where the sun would be hitting my tree. So I've completely lifted off. I still have a little bit of a tan color in there, but I no longer have the look of a full tree because it looks like the tree is there, but the sunlight is hitting the bark of the tree. I'll go to the tree beside it and do the same thing and go down just a little bit farther where that sunlight's still streaming in. And I don't necessarily want a straight line, so I can come down that tree on a bit of an angle with my lifting off. Yes, I'm wetting my brush. I'm using my angle brush. It has good firmness. I'm tapping, I'm dipping it into clear water. I'm tapping it off so I only have a damp brush. I'll do this center tree if you want to watch. And then I'm just rubbing that brush down the tree and removing the paint where the sun is coming in. Wherever the sunlight is, wherever the light spot is. So if you look at this picture now, you can see that the sun is coming in and it's bouncing off the trees. So this tree down below has sunlight here. So I'll take off the sunlight where that sun ray is coming in from the outside of the forest. So I want to carve out a nice clean line on my tree where that sunlight is hitting that tree. And on this last tree, I just have a little section near the bottom where the sunlight is showing on that tree. And I've had throughout some of my trees run just a little bit down, they've run just down into the ochre. And so I just used a brush and brushed that in. I'm just going to call that part of the picture. I just brushed it in so that it wasn't a problem. But what it's done actually is add a little bit of depth down below. It wasn't intentional, but I'm going to be happy with that. I think that's unplanned, but a little bit of added beauty to the picture. And now I'm going into fresh burnt umber, and I'm going to make 3 more trees. One's going to be really tiny, really skinny, so I'm not going to make that one just yet. But I'll start at the top of my page with burnt umber. And I'm coming down between 2 trees, and I'm coming beyond my edge of the forest. I'm coming beyond it. So I'm down lower than. So my tree sits, kind of looks like it's sitting in the middle of nowhere. I'll give that tree some roots in a minute. But I'm going to take that tree all the way up to the top. Remember, you want it to be thicker at the bottom, wider at the bottom than it is at the top. And then I'm going to give my tree just a little bit of roots. I'm not going to take sunlight, put any sunlight markings on this tree at all. This tree is on the outside of the forest, outside of where that sunlight is streaming in. And then I'm going to do another tree down the center between those 2. And it's going to come even a little farther down. And again, it also will not have any sunlight. It's sitting on the outside. So it's a little bit lower than the other tree. And I'm giving it some nice roots. So these 2 trees we've just done are darker than the other trees, and they don't have any sunlight carved out of them. And I'm going to trail those roots. So I'm just using the tip of my brush, and just giving a little trail of roots. And I've got one little last tree to do right beside this, right almost on the outside of the picture. I've got one little tree coming up with just a few trailing branches. It's just one little stick tree. Now, believe it or not, we're at halftime, so I'm going to read the card. And while you're finishing painting your trees, I'll read this. Have patience with all things, but first of all, with yourself. Write down ways in which you can be more patient with yourself. Keep this list handy to to refer to when needed. Have patience with all things, but first of all, with yourself. Write down ways in which you can be more patient with yourself. Keep this list handy to refer to when needed. Well, that would be interesting too, having more patience with ourselves. I'm not terribly patient when it comes to some mediums in art. I like to have things dry faster. And I think that's why I don't do some mediums. I prefer acrylic, which dries fairly quickly, and watercolor dries fairly quickly. So interesting. I could try the others again, but you know, I do like to have things dry fairly quickly. So let's move back up to the trees. We've done a little bit of work on the bottom. We've got some roots down below. We can start to see where the forest is with that gleaming sunlight through, just because we put those dark trees in the front. That gives us that illusion. So I'm going to start just with my zero brush. I've got burnt umber, so it's wet paint on dry. And I'm going to start to put some branches. And I'm working mostly with my frontal trees, just putting on some branches. So they don't all have to look the same. And if you're painting with somebody else, we all interpret things differently. So yours doesn't have to look like anybody else's. But I'm just adding some branches where I'm going to start to put leaves. And nice to use that nice white space. That way my leaves will really show up. It's not going to hurt the sunlight streaming through. So I'm just starting to put on some branches. If I decide I want more branches, then I can put them on, but this is just a few to start. And we could have pre-drawn this picture, but by pre-drawing it and then starting to paint your background, a lot of it disappears anyways. So most of my branches are going on my dark trees. Actually, all of them. I'm not putting any on the back. So you can put more or less branches. You can, if you have a really fine brush, you can, if you have a rigger brush, you can start to add some really fine branches if you like. A rigger brush is long bristles, and it's a little bit softer, and it takes away some of that control, but it also gives you really fine branches. And if you have a credit card handy with your art stuff, if you have it available, just we'll use the edge of a credit card. If you don't have a credit card, then we'll just use a brush. That's okay, but we'll use that to make some grasses. And so I'm going to start to make the leaves on my trees. I'm using this brush. It's hard bristled. It's fairly hard. I've dipped it in my green paint. I'm using sap green, so I'm using the same green throughout the whole picture. And with this bristle brush, I'm just going to press on and it will give me some leaves. So if you don't have a bristle brush, you can use a rounded brush. So I have a rounded brush. This is a number 2 round brush that I've got. And I can just use the side of it and give the look of some branches. So I'm just using the side, just pressing on, leaving a little bit of space, little bit of space so that there's room for the birds to fly or land on a branch. So I can do either or. I can use this, I call it a pokey brush. It's a bristled brush. It gives me a wispy look. And I'm just starting to put on the look of some greenery on the branches. And I'm not wanting to fill the whole thing in. I'm still looking for light in the background. So I don't want to overdo it. I just want a look of a bit of foliage in there. And remember, if I don't have a branch in a certain spot, if I have a branch here and it doesn't touch my tree, or they don't all touch each other, and I put greenery down below it or out the end, the eye naturally will fill in where it's not attached. So I just want to allow for the look of that streaming light to still be visible. So if I've covered any of that or too much of that, I can go back and I can just tap that off with a bit of water on a brush and just lighten that area so that I don't lose that sunlight area. I still want that to look like sunshine is gleaming through. And I might just take the light on this tree just down a little bit farther, just lifting off a bit of paint, just to bring it down a little bit more. Just leave those trees that are in the foreground in the front. Leave those trees nice and dark. If you like, you can add a little bit of darkness to them just to, because watercolor dries lighter, we can add a little bit of darkness to them again. But be careful not to be lifting any paint. And then we can start to work on that forest edge. So I'd like there to be green there. It's just a difference between ochre and green. It doesn't really show. And so I'm just going to put a little layer of green, avoiding my tree, my 2 trees in the front, or my 3 trees. I've got that other little one. So I'm just using the same green. And then I'm going to use my credit card. And if you don't have a credit card, using a brush, just in upward strokes, you start to create a little bit of grass. Just using the brush in an upward manner, just pull up and lift off. So you can do it with the brush, or you can do it with the credit card. With the credit card, you can go different angles, the same with the brush. So grass doesn't always grow straight. Grass grows in different directions. Sometimes it crosses over itself. So that's just with wet paint and a little bit of color. I'm just using the rounded edge at the corner. And if I happen to hit on my tree and I get a little space where the brown has lifted and it's whitened, that really adds to the grasses. So don't think that that's a mistake. That's quite nice to have that look like that. And let's practice that green again. So on the top of my root, at the very corner, I'm going to add some green paint. It's not completely just paint, it's a little bit of water, but only slightly. And then with the rounded corner of my card, I'm going to start just short feathery strokes, going right and left. Doesn't have to be always in the same direction. I'm just pulling that paint. I'm going to put some green around this other tree, just at the top where the root is, and at the side between where that little tree is, and right to the outside of my canvas. And this tree is a little bit farther away than the first tree that we just did, so the grasses need to be shorter. They won't be quite as tall. You can still cross over one another, but they need to be a little bit smaller. So it looks a little bit too rounded, so I'm going to put some burnt umber. Actually, I'm not going to use burnt umber. My apologies. I'm going to use ochre. And I'm just going to fill in that spot at the corner, just leaving a little bit of the ochre that's already showing. So I'm using ochre. This is fresh ochre. But I'm just patterning a little bit just to give that the look of behind the front tree. So it's a little bit of depth perception. And we're going to create a little bit, the look of earth. I'm going to mix a little bit of ochre and a little bit of burnt umber together. And I'm going to put a little bit of look of roots underneath my front tree, still leaving some ochre showing. So I don't want all of that lightness gone. And with a mixture of that ochre and the burnt umber that you've just used on the bottom, I'm going to lighten that or just thin it out with water. And just do a little bit of a wash, not completely cover the ochre, but just give a little bit of a wash in the background. So some ochre you still want to show through. And I'm just going to create a little bit more lightness on my tree. Just a little bit more sunshine coming down. And what's left to do is decide where do you want to put your artist signature? What's that going to look like? And so you can decide where you want to put that. There's lots of fiddling you could do. You could make your, parts of your trees. You could give it the look of bark, make it a little bit darker in different colors. You could embellish on your grass down below, add a little bit of brown markings just to give a little bit of that woodsy effect. Lots of different things, but you have the idea now how to create that background. So you're not actually painting the sun in, you're leaving the sun or leaving the background white and painting around it. So you actually create it. So wherever you decide to paint your artist signature, you can go ahead and do that. And if for whatever reason you're not completely satisfied with your picture of what you've done today, you've got the idea. And this doesn't always have to be done only in greens and browns. You could do this in blues, you could do it in purple. Lots of different ways to do this. So don't let it be the last time. If this is your first time on, come back again or try this on your own. And I'm blessed by you coming on. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for sharing time.